Welcome to another edition of Consensus on Reality. This is the first episode in our ongoing Pulp Magic series. The entire series is exclusively hosted on patreon.com/consensusunreality. For just $5 a month, you get access to all our regular exclusive episodes, interviews, written content, Discord server, and our full archive, and much more. For $10 a month, you can join our print club and get access to our printed Journal of Shells, which are coming out super cool. And we've included some other additional print items in there, like posters and postcards, and much more to come in that arena. In this Pulp Magic series, we focus on a unique saga of late Romantic and 20th century exoticism and how it spawned metafictions, hoaxers, hucksters, and hierophants in the many occult and spiritual movements of the West. We discuss such figures as Krishnamurti, Madame Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, Eugenia Macer-Story, T. Lobsang Rampa, Alice Bailey, and many, many more. We know this series is a deep dive and think it is essential listening for occult history researchers and seekers. So check that out for just $5 a month. That's the price of a cup of coffee. I know I do it often. That's the best way to support what we do. We're doing a lot of work over at patreon.com/consensusunreality. Check us out there if you enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. As always, enjoy the episode.
Welcome to another episode of Consensus on Reality. This is the beginning of a new series in Consensus on Reality, where we'll be looking at the influence of the East-West convergence and how that ended up influencing occultism up until the present day. And we'll start with an interesting figure that many of you probably know, at least through his creations, a person by the name of Sax Rohmer. But that is not his real name, of course. His name was Dave. His name wasn't Dave. You were gonna try. It's Arthur Henry Ward, who was a English novelist, but he went by the name of Sax Rohmer, and we're kind of entering into this weird new current we've not discovered, but sort of found ourselves mining. I guess that's a mixed metaphor, but we're going to kind of enter into it through the personage of Sax Rohmer and sort of weave out from there. We'll get into things like Theosophy, the sort of Buddhist and Hindu influence on Western occultism and the feedback loops that those generated.
Yeah, lots of Theosophy. Theosophy is kind of a binding element of what would become the New Age, and there's so much fascinating characters to unpack within the field of Theosophy. But I think also there's a weird kind of feedback that is occurring. A lot of it seems to also have to do with Tibet, and Tibet being opened, to the West, and a lot of characters claiming that they made excursions into Tibet. Some really did, some did not. Yeah. But yeah, Sax Rohmer is it's a pretty interesting and strange place to start, and the reason for that is essentially because I was reading from The Ninth Arch by Kenneth Grant, which is the final volume in the Typhonian trilogies. It's essentially based around a channeled text, the Book of the Spider.
It's so cool too, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really sick. And this text, oddly enough, is kind of is whole cloth contextualized by Sax Rohmer's novel "Dope." Which what's the other
And
title of
also
that?
his, I think it's dope, but also his collection Tales of Chinatown. Uh,
I thought that was the same
'Cause
book. No.
I think dope is a tale of Chinatown.
Yeah. Okay.
But they reference a few other things. Anyway, yeah, they were using, and I love that's what I love about the Grant stuff is how open they are about like using. I wouldn't call it like trash literature, but certainly like popular literature as
Pulp.
a pulp. Yeah, I mean Richard Marsh's The Beetle was the other text they were using in the Ninth Arch channeling, and that's more of like a classic Gothic Dracula tier kind of like novel. But
A good
yeah,
book
the
too.
use of Romer, yeah,
Yeah. So I was reading from the Ninth Arch and I noticed this and I was like, it's kind of on brand for Kenneth Grant. As we know, the Lovecraft connection historically, his having claimed that Lovecraft was actually experiencing emanations of some praetor human intelligence, and this is kind of the what he was characterizing in his fiction tales. But so the pulp fiction aspect, it kind of makes sense in the field of Kenneth Grant, because we know that his sort of archetypal channelings reach us through the funnel of fiction to
right,
contextualize and form these pure archetypal emanations of the mauve zone. However, it did remind me that one of your favorite writers, and a writer I'm very fond of as well, Eugenia Macer-Story, has
yeah,
the excellent book called Dr. Fu Manchu Meets the Lonesome Cowboy: Sorcery and the UFO Experience.
yeah. We should get into that a little later because it's funny how that's like a sort of the theme that she sets out with is this kind of the theme we're covering in a way
Mm-hmm.
that the influence of the East meets West aspect of occultism on society and the modern mind. But there's really not all that much Fu Manchu in it, except as sort of a framing device. But yeah,
I
when you
think
mentioned
not like
wanting to read
specifically.
that,
Like
right? Yeah,
that's kind of the ironic part is that the Fu Manchu books themselves are obviously quite problematic historically, and
yeah. I guess we have to talk about that for
oh
sure.
oh yeah,
But
that's
they're interesting,
it's at the heart of it.
right? Yeah, they're almost like uh, not not propaganda, but they were certainly, one of the big moments in the Sax Rohmer Fu Manchu thing is that some of the films based on his novels were like protested by, especially Chinese Americans, but like, Chinese immigrants all over the world in Western countries, and yeah, for good reason because the films and the novels they're based on, going back to them, reading a bit of the Fu Manchu books and watching a few of the films, you think like, well, how they're going to be of their time. How bad could they be? But they're like extremely, extremely racist. And I guess the Western countries at a certain point wanted China as an ally, so they were like, they told like movie studios, you can't make these movies right now. We need China.
Yeah, of course. China was an ally in the early conflicts in the East during the First and Second World War, and the Fu Manchu books were. It's strange because it's reactionary to the Boxer Rebellion, and it's
Right.
what it's called. The Yellow Peril was a fear of China. Importing their ideologies into the West, but also, kind of taking over the West. And that's why Fu Manchu
Right.
is kind of this arch villain, that kind of like it seems like the Bond films ran with the idea of a super
Absolutely.
genius,
Yeah. He
madman
was kind of the
villain.
first like super villain in a certain way. Like,
Right.
and even like a company like Marvel is still dealing with like the fallout. Like in some of their stuff, they had to like sort of disown the legacy of Fu Manchu in their own back catalog, I guess. And so it's a really influential piece of I don't know, like intellectual property, but it's also a kind of a tulpa or
Hmm.
something, which is kind of funny because tulpa being sort of lifted out of Tibetan Buddhist practices and then sort of used to create this caricature slash uh, because the Fu Manchu character is multi-dimensional to a certain extent. He has agency, and I was looking at some of there's this great website that compiled some of Romer's own writings on the source of Fu Manchu, and the way he puts it is he tells it a few different ways, which is telling, I think, in its own right. But Romer, who we should mention, was also if not a member, then at least affiliated with the Golden
Golden
Dawn,
Dawn,
as
yeah.
many of these guys were, and was certainly aware of Theosophy, and
Hmm.
that was all in the air back then in the teens and 20s when he was creating it. But he was basing this Fu Manchu character on a sort of kingpin of the drug and human trade in London's Chinatown. Mr. King was the name of it, and whether or not he ever actually met or saw this figure is unclear. But the Fu Manchu character came about when he was struggling to find a new. He was like, I want to make tons of money as a writer. This is what I want to do. And so he was, as people did back then, experimenting with the Ouija board. And
Hmm.
uh, the Ouija board spelled out, pardon my slur, but it just said Chinaman. And so there was this, he was like, well, I guess that's what my next character has to be. And it very quickly like took form as this kind of whole almost agent entity inside of his writing, this villainous Fu Manchu. And so it's kind of, and it feels like it harkens back to our own weird experiences with Ouija boards, like asking where we should go, and it said like Voynich or something, and like
Yeah.
just this like one word, heavily, uh, you know, full of implications, like
Yeah.
and so he kind of took that and turned it into this extremely influential piece of pulp literature that is still. I mean, if you think about Fu Manchu today, it's we have the mustache is a legacy of it,
I
and
mean, if
there's a
it,
band like it has the word is still
it's inarguable that it
yeah
would still be with us if it wasn't so outwardly racist. But it was wildly
right.
popular at the time, and these books,
It was huge.
they're you find them in antique stores all the time, and they were, the first film. I'm forgetting the exact title of it, but Fu Manchu is played by Boris Karloff. And,
Yeah,
for what it's worth, it's actually a pretty interesting movie, minus the overt caricature style racism, because there's like Tesla coils, and he's animating
yeah.
weaponry of Genghis Khan with Tesla coils. And I think they're actually filming these as practical effects. And, this is kind of the thing, too, of the decadent era. There's so much Orientalism, and there's also this strange channeled aspect of all of it when we think of the Mahatma letters and the Ascended Masters. But also if we
Totally.
think of the Book of the Law being characterized
Yeah, yeah. Egypt,
by,
like
by
it's like
ancient
through the
Egypt.
language.
But
Yeah, it's like through the language of Egypt, I guess, lifted by Crowley. I mean, I'm sure he was a student of that literature as that literature that there was back then, which was probably just like E. Wallace Budge,
But I would
and like
argue,
maybe
yeah, like how much of it, if you look at the Book of the Law, how much of it is actually influenced at all by Egypt, apart from reading some, near folkloric
right.
anthologies of religion and history, because it seems to be, Crowley's own opus coming from a portion of his psyche that is then characterized by the, by the scenery and by the actually being in Egypt at the time. And to me, I'm not necessarily discounting the channeled aspect in saying that. Because I think people might hear that and think, oh, well, that's, he's just writing a book and then he was in Egypt, and that's kind of the window dressing that he's putting on this statement.
Well, it has to come through the context. It has to, go through the context in which it was being channeled through. And Crowley was obviously very interested in Egyptian myth and magic at the time, as were all of these people.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, of course, yeah. Whether it was really channeled is something that will never be solved. But yeah.
As I get a call from the CDC, for some reason the CDC keeps calling me for a survey. I think it's like some kind of scam.
That's crazy. Yeah. Speaking of CDC, something that
slow down.
shouldn't go without mention is Fu Manchu's use of biological weapons in the books.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Crazy. And the way that kind of echoes with the yellow peril we had at the beginning of the pandemic. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's crazy. Very strange stuff. But he also uses insects, like he uses exotic insects, which is a very crazy Lovecraftian, Kenneth Grant style thing. But to circle back real quick, I think that the thing about, the channeling and the Ascended Masters, obviously the Egypt exotica of the 20th century has a lot to do with the cracking open and unsealing of King Tut's tomb. And, first laying eyes on all of these artifacts. And, this beautiful imagery that is so contrasting to a lot of, the religious imagery that we had for centuries. So there's clearly that, but there is still some inherent, it does seem that there is some inherent otherness, other consciousness that is communicating in these instances, whether it's Theosophy, possibly the Book of the Law. Obviously, we've covered in depth the Kenneth Grant stuff, and Eugenia Macer-Story is talking about this as well. And
it's huge.
with Sax Rohmer, it comes through the Ouija board,
Right. So, and it was so new then, like Buddhism, Hinduism, didn't really come to at least America until the middle of the 19th century in any understandable way. Of course, there was contact between these nations for a long time prior, and the East-West divide is not as clear as some of these writers would have you think. Like, even when we're talking about something like Orientalism, if you look at the Edward Said book, it's mostly about the Middle East, which is the root of Western civilization, right? So these boundaries shift. And so by the time we get to someone like Sax Rohmer looking at the so-called Far East with East Asia, and Fu Manchu coming out of, I guess, Manchuria, and which is another interesting, the way that word was later used in terms of mind control, and Fu Manchu's own use of stuff like mind control. So there's all this all these interesting echoes throughout the 20th century of the clash of these cultures as globalization starts to happen with, travel by ship and later travel by plane until...
I'm glad you say that too, though, because it kind of, what it really characterizes for me is these ebbs and flows of history. Because if you look back, I think that you can argue that Buddhism influences in some ways, abstractly or not, the birth of Christianity, through, places like Alexandria, where there were these collected religious texts from all over the world. And if you look back clearly, I mean, you have Zoroastrianism, which is the teachings of Zarathustra, which is something that we're going to talk about in this series as well. And and these things all kind of emanate from the Vedic texts. You have Mithraism,
Yeah, that's
which can be
huge.
traced back to Mitra from the Vedic texts. And it's an
Right.
interesting thing too. You can look at Theosophy as being very responsible for importing a lot of, let's say, Buddhist tendencies into the West. Yoga and the teachings that become so popular in the 60s with the counterculture and the youth culture.
Right.
At the same time, I think that's only one type of Buddhism, really. It seems like they were very attached to the monastic theocracy of Tibet. However,
Right.
that kind of differs from earlier forms of Buddhism in very stark ways if you look closer at it.
Yeah, and later, and also the sort of, although they're not really, they're kind of like sister religions with the, what became called Hinduism and all of
Absolutely.
those, all the stuff that kind of came out of India, and then that really interesting phenomenon of the Theosophical Society eventually leaving its
Hmm.
base in America and going back to India and trying to find its messiah in Krishnamurti and like his rejection of it. So it's this interesting give and take throughout the 19th and 20th centuries and up to today as well. Like the way occultism and like Western mysticism kind of feed back into this sort of appropriation of Eastern stuff, but then also like legitimate Eastern mystics kind of getting involved. So it's this, yeah, this really strange uh, melting pot, I guess.
Yeah. And I think that's there's a couple of different conversations to have here, like the true conversation of, the, the movement of religious concepts, religious ideas, commonalities in different religions as well, such as, the rejection of
Yeah,
the material world, which is something that kind of arises every time that, cities became more populated and more clustered, which I think you know, is kind of why Gnosticism seems to have, reemerged in the 20th century as well and became, so popular with things like The Matrix and all those films and even simulation theory, like that
yeah,
it's this kind of like pushback. And I think there's an explanation for that, and there's also an explanation for, the romantic reactionary movement to rationalism, because you can see this timeline of history where there's a rejection of Christianity and the Christian control of the West. And there's the Enlightenment, and then after the Enlightenment, there's kind of this vacancy, and then there's really a wellspring of Romanticism and searching for these national identities through folklore. Obviously, in Germany,
right.
but in other places as well.
What happened in Germany?
Yeah, but even something like the Brothers Grimm.
Sure,
The
yeah,
whole reason why they were seeking out those stories was really to build a national folklore and mythology,
absolutely.
not even build one, recapture what they believe to have existed before Christianity through these folk tales.
Right. That's like the whole ethnological project to a certain extent. And it reminds me of one of my favorite historical characters, Percy Granger, who spent, and he was an Australian composer and eccentric, and he would spend much of his career trying to collect these folk songs and kind of recontextualize and arrange them for a modern audience. And that kind of interestingly brings us to someone like Cyril Scott, who was also very enamored with both occultism and Eastern philosophies, which kind of came through in his music as well. Not someone I prepared to talk about today, but he's one of
Yeah.
my favorite figures. Yeah.
No, I think as an introduction to this whole series, it's kind of good to put, a lot of our cards on the table and things that
Yeah.
we're going to build out later, because it's really hard not to kind of mention it all when we're trying to contextualize what we're what we're after in this series. And even, something like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Really, a lot of, Tibetan scholars and people argue that there is no such thing as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There's not this commonality with the Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Right.
Really, it's that, Evans Wentz, who himself was a Theosophist, found a text, that dealt with funerary rites, and he titled it the Tibetan Book of the Dead, because there was a knowledge of the pre-existing Egyptian Book of the Dead.
Totally. Yeah, and he was like obviously had an angle on all of this stuff, being sort of a theosophist, and I think that will come up again and again, is that Blavatsky kind of created this direction. She had this like incredible spiritual momentum that is still pushing people in this sort of one direction for explaining a universal link between the religions of the world. And so someone like Evans Wentz going over to Tibet and meeting actual like Tibetan lamas and kind of gathering wisdom and literature from them. Of course, he comes back and tries to kind of comb that research into something that can connect with another, probably also relatively misused religious text. But yeah, we talked about him, and also A.P. Sinnett on a previous episode covering the Mahatma letters, which of course they're also hugely important here. And this whole idea of ascended masters, and they all live in Tibet and
Shambhala.
Yeah, in the mountains.
It ties into Agartha.
Hollow Earth stuff is huge here as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it becomes really interesting too in the arena of Fu Manchu, or, Richard Marsh's The Beetle, and then, later things like Kenneth Grant. But I think when you have this open space where you aren't really doing your due diligence, it's almost like what they say about a Ouija board itself, right? That you're letting something in. You're letting something, it's like the Christian pushback on the use of the Ouija board in itself, where they're like, you're opening yourself up to allow something, malevolent to communicate to you and potentially through you. And that's kind of what happens when you have this like very blank slate of fiction, and you are, channeling this idea of places through exotica, however you're receiving it. And, somebody like Sax Rohmer probably didn't leave England much, and Kenneth Grant seemingly didn't leave England much. Nor did who was the Egyptologist that he was heavily inspired by? I'm forgetting his name right now. It starts with a G. Or Macy?
I'm not sure. There was, well, someone like Schwaller de Lubitsch was also. Yeah, all of these guys. I mean, some of them did go to Egypt or wherever and sort of look at the actual material there, but yeah, a lot of it is kind of armchair theorizing, which, that's a lot of history, I think.
Yeah. And then, I mean, it gets so fascinating too, which is somebody else that we're going to talk about later. Maybe not in this episode, but in this series is certainly going to be Benjamin Creme.
Really interesting guy.
Yeah. In the middle of the 20th century was, actually a little bit later than that, like what, 70s, 80s, up
70s,
until
80s. He died recently.
Yeah, I heard him on Art Bell in like 2007.
And I was actually, for a little while, had a correspondence with one of his like major disciples who was kind of trying to incorporate George Adamski into the sort of into that that world, I guess. Like,
and he is incorporated into it, certainly, because he was associated with Theosophy early on, and his first book was a theosophical book about yoga, I believe, or maybe the Ascended Masters. I'm kind of forgetting what his first title was, but it didn't have anything to do with the Space Brothers.
Well,
But
yeah, he saw like a new. It's like somebody who pivots from like rock and roll to synthesizers or something.
yeah, and
There's like
Benjamin
a
Krem,
yeah,
was claiming that Maitreya, and that's a
savior.
weird thing too. The Maitreya in monastic Buddhism, it means something very different to them. But when we imported the concept of Maitreya through Theosophy, it kind of it became this second coming of Christ type situation, which
Right.
is it's so ironic that that's exactly what Blavatsky herself was so inspired by, to push back against was her rejection of Christianity. And yet she knew that to make people believe, to make people come aboard, she had to have these masters. There had to be
Right.
teachers that were, more powerful, they're more than human.
Yeah.
And
Something
maybe they
that's
were. I don't know. I mean, I feel
right.
that there
There's
was something, and there is
some
something.
yeah. I mean,
Passport to Magonia, right? Like,
yeah. It's so hard to get into like the reality of any of this stuff. Even to like scratch the surface of the history is so daunting because there's just so much and there were so many people like in the game of this current. But something I was thinking about when looking at all this is just how recent it all is. It's staggering how like the this Western understanding of Buddhism through Theosophy and through at least theosophically associated figures is like not all that much more than 100 years old. Like
mm-hmm.
it's so recent. Like Blavatsky herself, I don't, yeah, I mean, of course it feels old because, but there are photographs of her, it's not like this is like
Yeah.
ancient history. So
There's a
yeah,
heavy parapolitical aspect to all this too,
for sure.
and all of these people being accused of espionage, whether it was
Yeah.
Blavatsky, whether it was Crowley, whether it was Nicholas Roerich, who made his famous expedition in the Himalayas, which is chronicled in the book Altai Himalaya. It's very strange, and that's what's got us really excited about this series, Pulp Magic, that we're doing, because there's so many connections, and it's going through so many funnels, cultural funnels, and a lot of them aren't very diligent about presenting things accurately or representing cultures, maybe the way that that people want to be, these cultures would like to be represented. It's really seeing
Right.
it through your own eyes, which is problematic and has these interesting, strange results in a lot of cases. I mean, look at so many of the early films in America, the silent films of the decadent era, all have these exotic, Far East themes and iconography,
Yeah.
bastardized, I guess.
I think, yeah, this idea of pulp is something to maybe parse out a bit too, because I guess, I mean, we're not going to be talking about pulp. I mean, we will be talking about pulp literature in terms of people like Romer and stuff like that. But also, I feel like pulp is as a term of like things being kind of ground up and mashed together and then reused in
Mm,
this kind of not alchemical, but like almost alchemical sense of um, you know, mushing it down to this like very fine, almost papyrus like
yeah.
texture and then kind of flattening it out and reusing it like because the pulp literature as a magical or occult medium has been covered well elsewhere, and so we're certainly going to touch on that quite a bit um, over the course of this. But it also is sort of a play on words, at least as how I'm approaching it. Yeah,
It's so much more than just metafiction through this lens, though, And the crazy thing is when we look at ufological stuff, which relates heavily to this as well.
of
Especially
course. Yeah,
in this Eugenia Macer-Story book, which we'll get to in a sec. But if we think about how once you look at like one ufological thing, and it's like going down the rabbit hole, right? And there's this kaleidoscopic hall of mirrors effect. But when you're looking at this, there's a lot of very real tangential stories and histories and small micro histories and transgressions and movements and motives, and it's so fractured that it's going in a million different directions all at once. It's very strange, and there's a lot of really strange figures in the who shoot off from the theosophical base of Blavatsky,
Right.
and you kind of can't avoid them because, like I mentioned before, even though the Theosophical Society itself is certainly a shell of what it once was, its influence is so vast. I think
Totally.
it can't be
And
argued.
yeah,
I
every
don't
time we
know.
talk about it, I feel like we mentioned this connection between theosophy and UFOs, but that's because it's so strong and it's so overlooked still. Like, but another interesting connection would be the link between UFOs and Pulp. So kind of like
Hmm.
making a triangle out of it would be through Shaver, of course. And our recent interview with Dean Bertram was very illuminating on that front because, you know, to call Shaver and Palmer kind of the men who invented flying saucers is true. I mean, through amazing stories and those sorts of publications, it's it's that's how it came to be. That's how people first saw these things, and I think that's often true of these sorts of fringe or rejected areas of spiritual life and I guess scientific life too. Like they come through the pulps, basically, if not like literal pulp magazines, and through the sort of cheap tabloid aspects of culture. And that's still happening today. Like all of the, it's not quite a one-to-one comparison, but a lot of the, it's like a lot of the UFO discussion happening now is on Twitter. And it's like,
Hmm.
that's, I guess, the tabloid pulp arena of the day because it's like a popular literature sort of Twitter is. And I mean, this is a little bit out of date now because that whole platform has kind of collapsed. But yeah, that's like all of these kinds of things are always coming through these low areas of culture. Theosophy might be an exception and an important exception because it had so much support in, I guess, moneyed areas too, right? Like, um, it certainly received donations, but
And
all of that is
maybe,
to say,
some
yeah,
argue that more clandestine donations to spreading the will
right,
of communism.
maybe, yeah,
There was
or
certainly a
yeah,
very global message in Theosophy, and I think the message on on the surface wasn't necessarily a harmful one. But many would argue that the Soviet Union, I guess, was it even the Soviet? It was just the Bolsheviks were operating through Theosophy at that point.
certainly there was a connection, or some of the socialist movements were
Mhm.
involved in the occult organizations for sure. Even some of the other ones. Yeah, but so yeah, there's always a political dimension to any of these organizations because it's groups of people interacting with one another, and they have these different wills and they want to be represented in certain ways. And then the espionage thing as well, because they're international organizations, and so they're like the perfect candidates for spies, right? Like it's so much easier to be a spy who comes through as like a devout theosophist or a um, member of some cult today. I don't want to name any cults right now, but yeah, like yeah, there's always that dimension to it as well. So it's yeah, the parapolitical dimension. It's this. huge, many-faceted mineral, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have anything more to say about Romer? When I was kind of actually reading through I was reading through The Return of Dr. Fu Manchu, because that's one of the ones that I just happened to
Yeah.
have had. I picked up at an antique store myself because of I wanted to check it out and see if there was a connection, any inherent connection to the Eugenia Macer-Story book a while ago.
Yeah.
I kind of noticed that, in strange ways, I think that those books live on. To me, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but in Murakami's Wind Up Bird, or no, it's not Wind Up Bird. It's actually in 1Q84.
Hmm.
Or is it Wind Up Bird? Now I'm getting them confused. In one of them, I guess both of them have these kind of silent assassins, like
Right.
the character of Mei Kasahara. And I think in 1Q84, there's an assassin who slips like a pin into the back of somebody's neck and kills them instantly.
It
And
rings a bell. Yeah.
that's literally something that Fu Manchu can do. He can kill you
Right.
like without anybody knowing. That's a threat that's made in the book, that he can like stop your heart and nobody will know
Right.
what caused it. Like, it seems that elements of this fiction live on, and I think that Murakami would be somebody who would be wise enough to make parody of that, and make a nod to that, especially considering the significance of the peril that was
Yeah. Yeah.
expounded in Sax Rohmer's books.
Yeah. I wonder. I mean, they're kind of omnipresent in that era of like popular literature. They were, I mean, we kind of said it already, but they were so popular. And I guess another thing to mention about Romer, I mean, I mentioned that he was at least associated with the Golden Dawn and maybe Rosicrucians, but he wrote like a pretty famous book, The Romance of Sorcery, which I haven't had a chance to read all the way through, but looked at pretty closely for a little while. And something interesting he says is that magic and sorcery can trace its roots back to Egypt. And so we're kind of back to the same, like that old tale that like the tarot is like this ancient Egyptian
Hmm.
tool, which is not true. It's maybe Italian or French, but just this idea that you can kind of place the source of magic in this inscrutable ancient culture that is vaguely alien, although sort of related to our own. Like, yeah. And so Romer was appealing to that, but the book itself is pretty interesting and covers like Islamic magic and then uh, East Asian magic, as well as the sort of occult tradition in the West, which is another interesting thing. The sort of reaction against this Eastern presence in Western occultism, like this idea of like saying Western occultism itself is
Hmm.
a reaction against like theosophy and the Eastern presence in it. All of this like sort of pagan stuff, trying to get back to these European
Atavistic,
forest,
yeah.
yeah, like this, all of this Western magic, like the Norse stuff, like searching for this authentic European pre-Christian magic, which is so often kind of wrapped up, as is Eastern stuff with Nazism and with fascism in the 20th century.
Mm.
Um, all of that's kind of a reaction against this inclusion of these Eastern forms of mysticism into the Western occult canon. So, the Wicca stuff like that, some of the pagan and neo-pagan stuff, some of the ritual magic that comes out of a more strictly biblical tradition. But you can't go too far back without finding a road to the east in any of those things. So it's kind of funny that it all got mixed up again after being separated for a while. But then if you go back to the origins of all this stuff, it was mixed up anyway
Yeah,
together. It was always
absolutely.
this it was always this knot of influences, and now it is again, but they're trying to like undo it. So yeah, it's interesting how it gets untangled and they tangle it again, then it gets untangled, but it was always tangled.
Yeah, it's interesting how much we gain and lose too in the parsing out of these things. How much is already lost.
Yeah.
And I would say too, the Richard Marsh book, The Beetle, is interesting because it came out in the same year as Dracula, and it initially outsold Dracula. And it's a pretty good book. It's pretty funny. It's a very strange story about an Egyptian deity that wants to kill an English Parliament member,
Yeah.
and this deity takes the form of this green scarab beetle, and
Yeah.
it inhabits people in sort of this Manchurian Candidate style possession. It's a really interesting story, and it's pretty funny, and Kenneth Grant gravitated towards it so much, and his group, the New Isis Lodge, because it mentions a cult in the book itself called the Children of
Right.
Isis.
Yeah. Yeah, that part is crazy. And Richard Marsh himself is interesting. Just like a side note that he was the grandfather of, or some progenitor of Robert Aikman, who is a really interesting weird fiction writer.
Mm.
So there's a family tradition there. But yeah, I didn't read the whole Beetle book, but I looked into it a bit and read a bit of it, and it does really weird things with like gender and all this stuff too. Like the Beetle is like sometimes this Arab woman, and sometimes it's like this other thing. It's actually a great example of like weird fiction. Before that became like a solidified like post Mackin, post Blackwood. Like yeah, it's a strange book, and it's long though.
Mm-hmm. And it seem like this template of the Ascended Masters also was obviously adopted by Puharik in the Nine
Oh
Sessions,
yeah, totally.
because you
And
have these
yeah,
the Egyptian Nine and the Ra channeling.
yeah, all of that stuff. It's still so present and it's still happening like in any like weird new age cult that happens today. It's all still just based on this stuff. Like we haven't really moved far at all, except maybe now they'll call it downloading instead of channeling.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's that reminds me of I mean just to touch on a few things that we'll get deeper into in other episodes. Talbot Mundy is going to be important, I think. His He's another kind of pulp adventure writer, and he had a novel called The Nine Unknown,
Mm-hmm.
which was certainly an influence on the nine mythology of the 20th century. It was kind of a secret society. Walter Bosley has some really interesting material on Talbot Mundy himself, and I'm kind of slowly reading his novel Black Light, which is about a chemical company heir meeting with this interesting cult in India. And so there's so much of this stuff, especially from like the 20s and teens and 30s, about adventures in the East, especially in India and Tibet, and sort of meeting these very alien mystical sects and seeing like real magic taking place. Yeah, Talbot Mundy is going to be a really interesting figure.
And of course, there's
Um,
the Sirius connection as well. The Sirius connection,
yeah,
through I think most people will recognize that with Robert Anton Wilson. However, there's of course James Shelby Downard, who wrote I forget, I don't know how long it is. I think it's I'd have to look into it, and we'll bring the piece up. But he wrote a piece about a Masonic cult that worships Sirius at an observatory in the United States, and they all get together and have these
mm,
rituals and focus on the stellar rays of Sirius. And it is claimed that in the Great Pyramid at Giza, the chamber that would lead to the king's chamber would have the light of the star Sirius during the dog days of summer shine through it, and it would be part of the ritual.
Yeah.
But
Like the
there,
temple book itself
the
is,
temple book, and
yeah,
there's a million different ways to splice Sirius in, and it's just so much feedback between fiction, reality.
right.
It's very
Yeah.
interesting. But let's go back to Eugenia Macer-Story for now. And let's talk Dr. Fu Manchu meets the lonesome cowboy. Why would it be called that?
Yeah, I love this book. And I feel like we did an episode on it maybe 2 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And so we're kind of retreading, but this time I read it straight through, just cover to cover for the first time since I first found it in a bookstore, or I guess it was a record store actually, 10 years ago now. And she kind of starts out very, very hard on this Fu Manchu eats the Lonesome Cowboy idea of, um, it kind of leads her to Blavatsky, and she talks quite a bit about Blavatsky and the Ascended Masters in here, but it seems to have to do with people's understanding of the other, and when an alien or a sort of an unknown entity comes into play, how we look at that thing. And she thinks of it as like, and again, this is a hard book to summarize, as all of her books are, because it's not a book in the traditional sense with one argument. It's a book that by the end of it breaks down into this journal of her strange experience moving from New York to Woodstock and uh, being psychically harassed by these like entities and maybe intelligence agents. But let me find a good, there's a good excerpt in here that kind of gets into, um,
Yeah, I think obviously for me, if you break it down, and she talks about this in the book too. Basically, the lonesome cowboy would be us in the United States,
oh yeah,
meaning
yeah,
that we have, kind of this desolate, vacant, religious temperance of the world. And especially she talks about there's kind of no context for negative encounters with spirituality, which in the Vedic text there's a ton, arguably, as much or more. And even in Tibet and Buddhism in the David Neal book, which we'll talk about as well,
yeah,
Alexandra David Neal. She talks about the dark sorcery that was prevalent within non-Buddhists in Tibet, or even fringe branches of Buddhism that were not monastic Buddhism. But so yeah, we would be the lonesome cowboy, and the kind of the reason for this arising mythology of alien visitors from space, both terrorizing and sending messages and teachings to us, is because we kind of lost that context for otherness, for other consciousness and intelligence, and we've over years of refining Orthodox Christianity, and especially Protestantism really eradicates all of that. Even what you have with saints and saintly encounters of the ecstatic
yeah,
describe some pretty strange things. However, the movement towards Protestantism and the Reformation really eradicates all of that in the purity of God. And we really are just kind of in a desert void, without a context for those experiences that still occur. They're still happening to people.
totally.
So strangely enough, that is where, and many people argue this as well, like Jacques Vallée and possibly Diana Pasulka, that the UFO mythology, and of course Carl Jung spoke about this as well in his short volume Flying Saucers, that there was kind of this arising new mythology in the 20th century to fill that void. And Fu Manchu obviously being the East and the import of Eastern mythologies and these filtered emanations of Vedic texts, of Buddhism, of Sufism, right? And all
Yeah.
of these hammered out imports coming, making strange travels and journeys to the West from the East.
Yeah. The book is, I think that's actually really a good summary of her approach to this East versus West thing. Yeah, we have no context for these things, so we create a technological context. And that's, of course, not new, right? It's kind of comes out of ballet, like you were saying, to a certain extent. But I think the connection to magic here is really important. And this is her sort of follow-up to her book, Congratulations, The UFO Reality, which was a kind of her entry into the UFO conversation, not by choice, but by experience. Like she had an experience that sort of thrust her into taking this thing seriously. And so we kind of see here like her trying to work that out with this what she knows about psychic phenomena. And a lot of this book hinges on this interesting relationship she has with a few people in the Poconos near Toby Hanna and their weird kind of sightings and experiences of healing and the yeah, it's so funny. Like I come to this book and have all this stuff I want to say about it, and it's just so dense with information that sometimes it can be hard to say exactly what's so what's so important about it.
I mean, she
Um,
even talks about the Venusian, the blonde-haired Venusians that
of course.
Menger and Adamski encountered, and the similarities that they would have in some circles with the masters. But
Oh yeah,
she brilliantly compares this archetype with Wagner's Valkyries, and
right.
this kind of like cultural import. And that's how things come to us through fiction, right? I mean, that's how many people learn about mythologies through these fractured lenses of like Disney, of early Disney films or
Totally.
fairy tales, right? And yet there's something
Yeah, yeah.
essential in there that kind of shines through.
Something that I love about this book is the sort of blending between the her theory and then what's happening to her. Because I feel like before she's a writer, she's sort of a practitioner and psychic. So she's having these experiences and in some ways is completely open to commenting on things as they happen. So it's not like she comes into this saying like UFOs are sort of the same manifestation as spiritual entities throughout history. But that's sort of like what her experiences are telling her. And so the book itself is the process of kind of learning what these things are. There's also a really long and kind of strange detour through Oliver Cromwell's sort of time ruling in England.
Hmm. Massive. I mean, that guy was like changed the world in a lifetime.
Yeah. And
Isn't this the state of Israel? Can the birth of the state of Israel in the modern way that we know it can kind of be traced back to Cromwell and Ben Israel was
huh,
pushing for the state of
yeah.
Israel, and there was a whole conversation about having the Jews return to England because they were exiled at that point, I believe, right? I mean, this is kind of an offshoot, but Yeah,
Yeah.
Cromwell's crazy.
So she talks a lot about this weird kind of process she gets into of using Polaroids to capture, I guess, UFO phenomena, but also spirits. And she does this throughout her entire career using photography and electronical methods to capture these beings. And that's something that throughout the course of this series, I might start looking at. As soon as I have enough money to buy a Polaroid camera,
Mm.
I'm thinking of taking a little trip up to the Poconos to try and find roughly where she was talking about meeting these contactees.
Oh, yeah,
I
that
think there are
story is
three of
crazy
them.
with
Yeah.
the airplane. The
Yeah, it's made of mist. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like the unicorn and then these weird. Yeah. So she spent a lot of time up there during the course of this. And there's an issue of Pursuit magazine, which was Ivan Sanderson's Society for the Investigation of the Unexplained. Yeah. And in that, she has a long interview with the Johnsons, who were the one couple that she was kind of working with to figure this out. This is also where Cytron comes into her
Mm.
thing, which
Who
is
was
this,
from Sirius.
yeah, and is this like channeled robot. It's like a robot.
Yeah.
And the woman who's channeling Cytron has trouble breathing when she channels him because he doesn't breathe. And so there's like, because he's a robot. Um, and she relates that to, Shaitan or, and then Satan. And so she kind of traces this weird channeled robot entity through these mythological chains. And so the Dr. Fu Manchu meets the Lonesome Cowboy aspect of the book is kind of like a striking a match that sets ablaze the rest of these crazy associative kind of paths that she walks down. Like you were saying, Fu Manchu is kind of this representative of a culture, whether or not that's actually what Eastern Asian culture is like, is neither here nor there, but something that knows how to interact with these entities and understands that they are real and that there's, it's not just a matter of willpower and what's the word, like know-how, like and gruff sort of strength, the way that the cowboy would think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's this kind of, it's an interesting duality that she kind of presents here that is traced throughout the rest of the book in subtle ways.
Yeah, she says mystery buffs are all familiar with the stereotype of the highly intelligent yet devious and inscrutable Oriental. Even someone who has not read the Fu Manchu stories knows what is meant when Dr. Fu Manchu is mentioned with a mysterious grimace. A
I love that
similar,
line. Yeah.
yeah, a similar Western stereotype might be the reckless and over-aggressive Yankee who barges into the parlor, knocking over furniture in his haste to drive the carpetbaggers off the ranch. I mean, this is so indicative of the UFO thing, though, right? I mean, like, you could even look at the experience of Whitley Strieber and argue that he was being contacted by the ascended masters through wearing a different mask, you know?
Yeah.
And the kind of way that Skinwalker Ranch approaches the UFO question is kind of this, obviously this cowboy, like,
Right.
we're gonna
Ranch.
investigate this thing and we're gonna throw a big net on it and bring it down, you know?
Yeah. Actually, the paragraph that comes right after what you just read, I feel like almost serves as a mission statement for what we're looking at here. As East meets West electronically via high-speed communications, Dr. Fu Manchu meets the Lonesome Cowboy, and there's a difficult interface between the two cultural presuppositions, which often cannot be talked out carefully during a conference at the Statler Hilton.
Yeah.
So, she's kind of talking about this thing that we've been talking about, which has been going on since, the world kind of opened up, which is the give and take between these already kind of linked um, cultural approaches. You know, they have probably roots somewhere back there in the same zone. But at this point, we're kind of reconverging, and have been for over 100 years. And it's kind of getting weird now with this. And she wrote this, I think, in the late 80s, early 90s. So it's even weirder now. The high speed aspect of this is kind of creating these weird hallucinations within culture that we're seeing kind of proliferate into,
Synaptic delusions, and it's like
yeah,
there's a strange element too in that our kind of as Westerners, normal people's experience with consciousness, let's say, with the collective unconscious and with these archetypal psychoidal states where things materialize, and clearly they're materializing to Westerners with an Eastern aesthetic. Arguably, that's also in some of the early ufological stuff as well, right? Because I mean, a lot of people were describing seeing people that they thought were of Asian, looking Asian, of Asian
the
descent.
like the Men in Black thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's also in some of the early encounters too, right? Like,
Some of them, yeah. I mean, because some of them are like the Nordic yeah, type,
yeah,
uh,
yeah, yeah.
and then some of them are, yeah. So I mean, there's always been this weird racial aspect to it because, of course, there is because that's our only metaphor for understanding difference between
Mm-hmm.
like intelligent beings, and it's it's how we approach the rest of the animal kingdom too. Is like this sort of racial uh, taxonomy. God damn it, I can't
Taxonomy.
remember. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Um,
the irony of it is that, like, I mean, I feel like, and this would be speaking for people in the East as well, which is kind of comical. But I feel like they would be like, the Westerners are finally opening their mind to otherness, and yet it's so much about materialization and the phenomena of delusion, which is so not the point of conventional Buddhism, right? Like it's totally the
right.
opposite. Is to escape materiality. I mean, that's kind of the thing, even comical thing about tulpas, right? Like, I think in Tibetan Buddhism, tulpa describes the state of materializing thoughts. It doesn't actually describe like a walking thing like in Twin
Right.
Peaks, you know? But
Yeah.
and yet, like, so many Western paranormal shows in the past, 6 years have just been talking about tulpas as these like thought forms that walk around and
Right. Like a pet or
mm-hmm,
like a sort
mm-hmm,
of it's almost more like a spiritual servitor or something, like
yeah.
something that you kind of create, which is kind of out of I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert on Buddhism at
No, there
all. I'm
is a
not even
ton of
like a
that in there.
yeah.
They're the runner. What are the runners called? Fuck. Is it like? It kind of sounds like I'm looking at the Lob Sing Rampa books. It kind of sounds like
Yeah, that's
Lob Sang.
yeah.
Like I just looked it up earlier actually, but it's these. It's like an aesthetic form of running where people run like marathons consecutively, not like as we know, like a marathon running around New York City or
Yeah.
whatever, but they run these like great lengths, and I guess they reach this point of ascension through isolation and
Mm.
rejection, and then like there's all this like mythology of them being able to basically like fly or travel at great speeds, but their
Yeah, yeah.
role is essentially to be sent out into the mountains to capture evil wandering spirits.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the evil spirit stuff is crazy. It's really interesting, yeah. But yeah. the the Macer-Story book is something that I feel like we'll have to look back at again throughout the course of this because I feel like it does, in its own sort of unique way, inform some of this path that we're on, talking about these things.
Absolutely.
And in some ways, I feel like it's you know kindred with some of the Grant stuff in a very different way.
Hmm.
Um, her use of Lovecraft
Yeah, she's talking about
in the beginning of
Lovecraft
the
a lot.
book,
Yeah.
and just kind of the way she approaches these the fiction versus real divide feels very much like something that Kenneth Grant would have understood and maybe sympathized with, although she's very different. Yeah, they're both also very hard to paraphrase.
Yeah. I think a figure that we're going to be talking about too in this series is certainly Lamb. Um, and Lamb's, the famous drawing by Aleister Crowley,
Yeah,
which was extrapolated further, much further, by Kenneth Grant in his Typhonian trilogies. Maybe, Kenneth Grant is probably responsible for giving Lamb the life that he has, or it has,
probably. Yeah,
because I think Crowley was less connected to it than Grant certainly was.
Lamb is like almost a meme now. Like,
Yeah, absolutely,
and
yeah,
that's and it's interesting the way that some of these occult illustrations of these entities kind of prefigure some of the artistic style of like the memes that go around right now. Yeah, I was looking through the Ninth Arch and I just kind of went to the index and looked at all the mentions of Sax Rohmer, and I love how they kind of are just appealing to Sax Rohmer's novel Dope as like kind of like a religious text,
yeah,
and they're just saying like because what the bulk of the book is like a exegesis of this channeled Book of the Spider, and so it's like that which is like 100 or so pages, and then comments upon it, and so many of the comments are like we think that the channeler here may have been referencing, this page on Sax Rohmer's Tales of Chinatown or something.
uh
And
huh,
it's and like there's like this hidden meaning between the names and in in Rohmer's like sort of maybe racist, I don't know, Asian characters. Like there's like this sort of hidden like phonetic magic within them. And Grant even goes so far as to say like we know that this probably wasn't intentional in the writer, like we don't think Sax Rohmer necessarily was encoding his writing with the Book of the Spider or whatever, but we're using it like that anyway. So there's this kind of uh showing the hand of the process here, which is like beaming intention into the past back onto these fictional creations,
yeah.
which is so fascinating.
But I think in the same breath, it's also revealing the genius and brilliance of Grant's own works in that
Yeah,
Grant himself is this exoticist, and they're
right.
like his Grant's own work is colored with Orientalism and
Yeah,
leaps of the truth in terms of history and cults of shadow and religions. I mean, a lot of it, like the cult of Ku, right, is what's is this legendary cult in the works of Kenneth Grant, and this is something that probably originates from Sax Rohmer's fiction. So I think in using something like Sax Rohmer or the Beetle, even though he says he used it because the channeler is coloring it, I think he's also
right.
recognizing that his own work is so colored by exoticism and a world
Yeah,
building of fabrications of I wouldn't call them fake worlds, but I would say they're certainly not, and they're not intentionally not supposed to be accurate pictures of the world.
right. They're fantasies, which are kind of
Yes.
little miniature worlds unto themselves. In that way, I feel like Grant is like the ultimate pulp writer because yeah, it is very pulpy.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely. Yeah.
it's not pulpy in the sense that it's simple and like sort of entertaining because it can be entertaining, but it's certainly not simple. But
Yeah.
pulp in terms of it being like a stew of all these different things where you can't really tell what's a carrot and what's like a potato anymore because of how long it's spent, over the stove.
Yeah. It's interesting too because you say, fantasies, which is what they are, although it's presented as nonfiction. But there, at the same time, there's this concept that, beneath all of the window dressing is a truly magical subtext. Something transcendental underneath it all that is communicated
Yeah.
wearing these garments of ritual, wearing these garments of these fantastic garments of you know incense room filled delusions and costume and great masks and all of
Yeah.
this. But at the same time, there is something truly essentially magic underneath it all that is being communicated maybe subconsciously. I mean, that's, and
Right.
if that's not true, then that is the pulpiest thing ever, right? To make
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
claim or to even assert that or have your acolytes like Michael Staley assert that
Yeah.
is possibly the most pulpy thing to acclaim that there's actual real magic in your books.
Right. And like putting a warning before
Yeah.
your book is like it's like something Stephen King would do almost, but
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's very he is an entertainer to some extent, which is where even though it's like not it's like a I don't know, it's built on this model of pulp literature and like intrigue while being this bizarre, endlessly complex system of magic, I guess. Yeah.
Fantastic. I loved it. I think that's a good jumping off point for this episode
Yeah.
and I think we have so much to talk about in this series, and this is probably going to consume us up until the at least into the fall. So
Yeah.
we hope you're on board with this. We've got so much great stuff to talk about in here, and it's just I've got so many books in front of me that I've been reading from, and even like these old anthologies of mythology from the early 20th century, which
Yeah.
are often like inaccurate in terms of a lot of stuff, especially the Eastern stuff.
Yeah.
However, it paints a really interesting picture of how Westerners viewed the world, and what kind of ideologies are being written into these anthropological texts.
Totally.
Pretty fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and so we have like a couple definite points that we're going to get to throughout the course of this, but if you Patreon listeners have anything that you think fits into this thread, I think we're certainly open to hearing about it, especially if you're pretty well versed in Buddhism. I feel like that might be somewhere where
Mm-hmm.
we're slightly lacking, but yeah, I think this is going to kind of grow as it goes, and hopefully, yeah, you're along for the ride. Certainly have a few interesting books that I'm looking at as well. We might see Mr. Lavenda pop up
Of
again. We
course,
might
of
see,
course.
uh, of course, Talbot Mundy, and I think pretty soon we'll be having a little look at the really interesting T. Lobsang Rampa, who is
Absolutely, yeah,
might have been just a British plumber.
yeah,
Yeah, that kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah. Incredible. So many characters. It has so much to do with I think what we talked about during the Carlos Castaneda episode too. The kind of a myth made in America, and that the
Yeah,
desert the vacant desert of American mythology being this open canvas, which so many things are refracted upon. And so many people ended up wearing so many different masks in the 20th century as well. Cool. Yeah, so jump in the conversation on Discord. This is episode 1, and I think this was a kind of a good primer. We hope to get a little bit deeper into some of the specifics in the next couple episodes. So we'll catch you soon. Thanks for listening. As always, if you are a Print Club member, we are working on Volume 3 of the Journal of Shells. Should be on schedule with that in ready for the beginning of fall. Really excited about that. We've got some special stuff lined up for that, and looking forward to mixing some interviews in and having some, a lot of stuff to talk about with this series. So we're really looking forward to it. Thanks for listening, as always.